Super excited to bring you this very special Monarch butterfly oil painting demo. We're going to be using Utrecht Artists Oil Colors on a pre-stretched and primed 8x8 cotton canvas. We're going to be using various oil painting techniques such as making a glaze, painting light and shadow, and working fat over lean. We're going to incorporate a couple of oil painting mediums that are going to help to speed up the drying time and also make our paint a little more workable in the process. We're going to be working with a sketch from observation, and you can print out a free reference image on our project bundle page. If you go and check that out, you can find all the materials that we're using here today so that you can make a butterfly oil painting of your own at home in your own studio. So let's go ahead and get started and dive into some of these techniques. I've already set up my palette for our painting journey, and I've set it up with analogous colors near each other on either side of my palette. And by analogous, I mean the colors are situated close together on the color wheel. So my blues and greens, my cool colors are on the left, my yellows and reds, my warmer colors are on the right. I have plenty of titanium white to start because we're going to be using lots of titanium white as we paint. And then I have my black down here at the bottom. Both can be used to adjust the temperature of your paints. I also have a 2 palette cup system attached to my glass palette. And on one side I have Galkid, which is a fast drying paint medium. And on the other side I have a Utrecht painting medium, which is simply thinner mixed with a bit of varnish that gives your paint that fluidity that we need to get those initial lean layers down. So let's go ahead and dive in. For your sketch, I recommend using a charcoal pencil, and that's going to hold up really nicely on your stretched canvas. So this is just a typical charcoal pencil, nothing special. You can use a graphite pencil, but I have found charcoal to hold up a little bit better when it comes to oil painting because it is such a heavy-duty medium. So let's get the basic elements of the Monarch sketched out. And we know that the Monarch is incredibly recognizable for its bright reddish, orange, and yellow markings with that striking black layer all around. So we'll be thinking about that as we plan out our colors for our painting. And so we're going to draw some of these spots, if you will, trademark spots. And I don't like to get into too much detail with my initial drawing. I just want to get enough information down on the canvas that we can start to block out our initial color. And let's not forget these nice pock marks, almost, that the Monarch has. All right. All right, and then we have a cone flower here. And I really like the cone flower because it stands out really nicely from the Monarch. And it has these great texture lines that we can incorporate that help to tell the direction of the flower. So if you look at the sample that we have here, there's a kind of direction, and it's not a hyper-realistic painting, it's the idea of the butterfly that we're painting. But it gives your mark making a direction to go in. So we get a little bit of shape out of that process. Just a quick sketch with some direction lines. Okay, and then the cone flower in the center has this really nice texture where its seeds go. And I know I'm thinking about getting outside in the summertime when I see this reference image. And it could be a great opportunity to go out there on your own and make some sketches from observation so that you can take them back to your studio later and continue working. We've got a little bit of smudging, that's okay. If you don't like the smudging, you can always use a kneaded eraser and you can help to bring some of that up. But it's all going to get covered up anyway. We have a couple extra marks here. Okay. Let's go ahead and get started with our painting. Let's not waste any time. I'm going to get started with my largest brush. We're going to kind of work large to small in a way. We're going to start working with this background and get some information filled in. Now this is just a little secret of my own. You don't have to do this, but I do like to take a little bit of this Utrecht oil painting medium and just distribute a little bit onto my palette. Now there is a small amount of fumes that are going to come up from your oil painting mediums, and so if that bothers you, make sure that you wear a mask, and certainly you don't have to use more medium than is necessary. But what I like to do, the reason I like to do that is because I can start to easily mix down my colors and start to get them working. And so part of the reason that we set up our palette with these analogous colors is because we can start to blend them from top to bottom and get a really nice range of colors going on our palette. And I'm just going to be working with the greens for now, so I'm adding in white. White is going to help you to get that initial coverage in your background. And I'm also using a painter's rag over here. And now I'm adding in, to swipe my brush, and now I'm adding in a little bit of Galkid. That's that fast drying medium that we were talking about. And it just really helps to get these layers set up. So this is really what we're looking for. Okay, let's go ahead and apply some of this. We have a combination of earthy greens and blue greens that we can use. So let's start to work that in here. And I can kind of let the greens alternate, and it gives it a feeling of light changing in the background. So we're just going to work a little bit quickly to get these the initial background set up, and I'm just going to work my brush in different directions. And the reason I'm kind of working the brush in multiple directions is because I want to get it worked into the canvas. Okay, so the big goal is to, something that I always learned with oil painting, with painting in general, is that you really want to cover the canvas background. You want to cover any white. And sometimes you need to really work the paint into the canvas to really make sure that you've covered all of the surface area, because if you don't, you might see some of that white come through, and it might make your painting look unfinished, and maybe you don't realize it. So the best thing to do is to take some time and just really work that canvas. Now I'm going to let my dominating color be that bright green, because we don't want our background to get too dark. We can always darken it, but we can't always lighten it. So we want to work light to dark in that way. And I can really get the edges using this bright brush. And that just refers to the shape. Okay, and I can just work the edges. And pushing the brush into the substrate helps to get that coverage that we were talking about. So when you're painting particularly with a drawing like this, everyone starts their oil paintings differently. But when you're working around these detail areas, and I'm just adding in more Galkit as I go, that's going to help that drying time, you want to use your brush in a way that fits the space you're trying to fill in. So even though this is a brush that I can use with a flat brush stroke, when I hold it up and fan it out, I can fill different spaces. So the brush that you're using should work for the space that you're trying to fill. And there's no one way, to do that with a brush. So I just wanted to add that in, that your brush is more versatile than you may realize depending on how you apply pressure onto the substrate. All right, so then this, another concept I wanted to make sure that we covered in this demo is the idea of working with oil paint in fat over lean layers. So your fat layer is your oil from your oil paint. And your lean layer is the layer that gets broken down, to put it one way, it gets broken down so that you can paint a thin layer or a lean layer. That's, that you've broken that fat from the oil paint down with a paint thinner, making it lean. So you want to paint those leaner, less oily layers on the bottom, because when you paint your fatty, oily layers over it, it's going to stick better and you're going to get better coverage overall. And you can paint as many lean layers as you like, but you will start to see results as you build those layers up. So just a little tip for you as we work through this. All right, so we've got as much of this information down as we need for now. So I'm going to also just show you guys my painter's rag. When you're dealing with hazardous waste materials and you're trying to be environmentally conservative, like I know we all are, it's nice to have a painter's rag that you can, always clean your brush off and without having to use lots of paper towels. And then you can deal with your rags and your hazardous waste materials later, which we can talk about. For now, let's start to make our glaze layer for our cone flower. Okay, let's cover more ground here. I'm going to be using a filbert shape brush that's going to go nicely with these layers. And I'm going to take a little bit of this painting medium, and I know I'm going to be using these magentas, oranges, yellows pretty soon, and I know a little bit of that white. Again, that's just a personal preference that I like to do there. It's up to you if you want to try that little trick. You're welcome to wear gloves when you're oil painting, if that helps to protect you. You can also use a barrier cream where you apply barrier cream to your hands and it helps any paint materials from getting on your skin. This is just some magenta paint, quinacridone magenta, that we're going to use, and I'm going to take some of my white and I'm going to make a nice light, not too dark layer to start my cone flower out with. And load up my brush here and let's go ahead and go for it. Just start painting that in, and again, use your brush to fill the space that you're working on. I can add in more white. Again, we want this to be as light as possible, and you'll be looking at your reference image and determining how light or dark certain areas need to be. And I'm going to bring in some of this Galkid, and you can kind of see now that I have these two mediums working together, the Galkid and the oil painting medium. Look how my oil paint just melts on my palette and turns into this really smooth, very soft, you know, melty oil paint. And that's exactly what I'm going for. And I can adjust my painting formula to be a little bit thinner or a little bit fatter, a little bit leaner or a little bit fatter, and really get the consistency that I want. So just a little tip there. So now I've got this nice and light, and I can work nice and quickly to get this initial layer down. And you'll notice when your first layer dries, say after maybe you let it set up for a day or so, let it sit in the open air and let it set up a little bit. You know, once you get these initial layers on, you want your oil paint to, you want it to start to dry a little bit as you work, because that way when you go to put your next oil paint layer on top of that, it doesn't go moving around underneath your next layer. I think one of the things that people notice about painting with oils is that you're constantly blending and blending and blending, and sometimes you can't stop blending. And the colors won't sit on top of each other like we're used to with watercolors and acrylics. But if you think about it, we're being a little hard on oil paints in that case, because with any paint that we use, we want to give that first layer, if we want to paint another layer on top, we have to let that first layer dry a little bit. With watercolors, that might only take an hour. With acrylics, that might only take 2 hours. Well, with oils, that could take a couple days. But it doesn't have to take all that time if you're using a medium like Galkid, which is fast drying. So a couple little tips there to help decrease the drying time if you're really trying to work through something. And then you can eliminate some of that stress of the constant blending that we feel like happens when we're painting with oils. And I also want to point out how easy it is to still see my drawing. And it's still incredibly easy for me to tell where all of my elements are still meant to go. All right, so we've got some really great coverage happening already, and we're going to come back and we're going to keep adding on to that. So I'm just going to swipe off here on my painter's rag, and let's get a little bit more information established here. Now, if I want to clean my brush, I have just regular thinner, and I have it here in a silicoil tank. The silicoil tank has a metal ring inside that you can run your brush along, and your oil painting sediment falls to the bottom, and the clean thinner remains at the top. And with that device, you can continue to use your thinner over and over and over without having to replace it, which is huge because then you're not dumping it down the drain or into the environment somehow. So let's get this cone flower of ours started. And I'm going to take a little bit of this. I've got a little magenta in there. Okay, let's take a little bit of this naphthol red and just a little bit of this cadmium-free. I'm using cadmium-free orange and yellow here. All right. And then just a little bit of my yellow. This is really a nice glowing color range that we can use to just start to map out where our cone flower is going to go. And our color matching doesn't have to be perfect at this point. We do get a little smudging from the charcoal. That's okay. That gets covered up later as we build out our layers. we're just pinning down the idea of where that's going to go. All right, and we know it kind of breaks up there. All right, perfect. Let's keep moving. I'm just going to get a little bit of this here. And look how quickly we've started to map out these initial layers. All right, let's clean off the black. Let's get started on our Monarch, and we'll get those colors mapped out. So the Monarch, we talked about these beautiful signature oranges and yellows. So let's go ahead and navigate those here now. So let's go back to our naphthol, which is a nice kind of transition into this bright orange color. This nice fiery color, and I'm helping to move it along with a little bit of Galkid. And let's get that painted in. And these colors, these areas are really exciting because I think this is where our painting starts to really look recognizable. And I'm just quickly putting these layers down. Now, let's say you're out there and you just want to go straight for the gullet. You want to slap those oil paints on, and you know, you just want to get going. Well, I recommend sticking to that fat over lean concept. If you lay down too much oil color at once, then you're not going to be able to deal with it as easily down the road. So it's just something to think about, that you might get a little too much texture too soon, and it'll be more difficult to finish. So it might be easier to start, but more difficult to finish. Now, one of the things I enjoy about this part of the blending process is that I can bring in and start to insinuate some of my shading here. And this is just brightening things up for me. And I can continue to work in this way to bring light into these different areas. But let's keep moving. Let's move into our yellows. I want to keep my brush clean. Swipe it on the thinner. Swipe it on my painting rag. Let's bring in some white and some yellow. And let's get a nice pale yellow for some of these other areas that we're working in. A little bit of this orange. And here, see how easy it is to work with these colors and take them from shade to shade as we work. So let's fill these in. And I'm just painting loose right now, loose and light for these layers. Maybe we want a little more orange, medium orange. But I can adjust that. See how easily we can adjust that with the way that we've set up our palette. Okay, and these are all kind of orange. And so I'm also, you know, I'm not trying to tackle the whole painting at once. I thought about, you know, how to break down the shapes and how to break down the color order, and, you know, thinking ahead in that way can really help you to organize your painting effort so that you have a plan when you go in. Let's take some of that light yellow. I love having a plan, which is why we have provided the reference image, the materials and the instructions so that you can go and have that as a resource to help you get started on your painting. All right. Now I have a couple more. All right, let's get this. A couple more light yellow areas right here. And all right, so we've actually got quite a bit of information mapped out. Let's get that black for our Monarch's body and the white spots that go along with it. And remember, this is just our underpainting. So once we get to the next step, we're going to round it off with some palette knife painting. So let's move right along here to our, now we want our black to act kind of like an ink in this step. We want that really smooth coverage. So go ahead and take your Galkid and look how smoothly that's going to cover. Easy. And then we'll just do light brush strokes. Paint in the little Monarch elements here. Okay, and then get those wings, that very recognizable wing structure. Okay, and we're going to go all the way around the edge, picking up more paint as I need. And you might blend a little bit with your green, but that's okay. We're going to make our edges nice and crisp later on. I want to make sure I have enough painting medium. Okay. And I'm leaving a little bit of negative space, as you might be able to tell, for some of those white spots. Another recognizable characteristic of our Monarch. Okay, and then we're going to go dive right in here, in between the spots. And let's get it down nice and quickly. Trying to move as quickly as possible so that we can get to our next step. But if you're hanging out watching and you're wanting to get started, then I would check out the project bundle page, because it's going to help you get liftoff to getting started on your oil painting project. And one of our biggest concerns, I think, when we want to get started is what to paint. And here it is for you. Content managed. And you can easily step in and take the reins and make it your own. Okay. And being diligent about how you outline can really help to drive the imagery. I think, you know, being as deliberate as possible without getting too hung up on the details is really important here. And I'm excited to start our next step. All right. Now maybe your first layer isn't perfect, and it's not supposed to be. That's just your roadmap to where you're going to go with this. All right, we've got a really good start. I want to show you just one more technique as we're working on this layer before we get to the point where we're about ready to bring the painting home and give it its final texture and details. But as you're working, I think in the sense that we're using this as a roadmap for our palette knife painting, I think adding a little bit of light and shadow and knowing where some of those color layers are going to go is really going to help you make this thing work. So I have another brush that I'm going to bring in here that is a filbert shape. And I'm going to go back to kind of where my colors are here. And I can use this nice, bright, lean magenta and use it as just a certain shade darker, and I can work on filling in this white area. So before you move on to your next layer, go around and incorporate a little bit of variation of light and shadow. And you can do that by adding the color mixed with white. You can add the color mixed with a little bit of medium without white, and that will make it appear darker. You can add just a touch of black. I'm not going quite that far with my shading here, but you can if you want that stark contrast. But I think for here, just a little bit of this magenta, bringing out some of this light and shadow is just going to help us get coverage on these initial layers. And you'll be so glad that you took the time to do that step. All right. Okay, and then another tip that I like to tell people is at the corners where objects meet is where you'll find a great opportunity to incorporate a little bit of shading. And it just helps to set your objects away from each other. So just a little tip there if you're at the point of investigation with your oil painting process. Okay, now you can keep moving in that way, adding your light and shadow, and you get just this little bit of texture. It's already starting to look a little bit more like that piece that we're going for. Now let's take a little moment to, I'm going to use a little Venetian red. This is something for the cone flower to help set the seed pods away from the petals. And, you know, blend. Use your oil paint as an opportunity to blend rather than, you know, looking at it as a hindrance for, you know, how it dries slowly, and thinking about that as an advantage, I think is really going to help you. So now I'm just kind of leveraging my warmer colors to build this base layer and make it blend nice and naturally. All right, now I'm going to want to take these detail brushes and I'm going to want to fill in all those little white areas. So take your time, take your brush and close the gap on those areas. That's a little muddy, but there. And use the colors to help you get an advantage on that, making that nice crisp outline. Okay, So let's take it to the next level. Let's get this oil painting squared away. Once you've got your glaze layer down, you've covered all the white, take your detail brush and work your paint into those white areas. Make those edges nice and crisp and clean, okay? And then once you do that, let's set this off to the side. We're gonna let that dry and come back to it later. This is really where we wanna be when we start those final layers of those final fatty layers, okay? So here's our nice lean painting. I've, built a couple of layers, letting them dry a little bit in between and really mapping out, where exactly these colors are going to go from that final touch. You can see nicely here, and this is kind of funny. Here's our stem, okay? Here's our stem. All right, let's go ahead and work that in. That's an easy one. All right, perfect. Now we can move on. So I'm ready to show you this final piece. And so I have a couple of options here that I'm going to be using. I have these palette knives. These are a size 44 and a size 20 of the wooden handled palette knives by Blick, made in Italy, that as a painter I couldn't do without. So I highly recommend a range of palette knives for paint mixing and application all together. And let's go ahead and get started here. The other thing I'm going to do in these fatty layers is I'm going to take a brush that is nice and dry, and it's just the same filbert. And but I'm going to get a really nice grip with these bristles so I can get a nice textured layer on top. I'm going to show you that first, and we're going to start to build up our textures from there. So if you remember these nice fiery colors that we put down here, I'm going to take a little bit of painting medium just because I do want the paint to be nice and workable. But I'm going to take a lot more of this paint and bring it in. So the more paint you have to medium, the more fat the paint will be, the more oily. But I don't want to leave it totally on its own without any painting medium, because then I know, at least it will help the drying time a little bit. So let's get this mixed in. But let's go back to this nice kind of gradient that we started here. It'll just be a heavier paint mix, fattier. All right, let's take this. This looks great. All right, I'm gonna just get rid of some of that excess. All right, and then let's paint on a nice heavy body texture and even get a nice brush stroke going. And you can see I'm just going right over that layer, and I can do that same technique that we did before, where we bring in, these other colors that just blend, right on site. And you can add light that way. You can add some brush strokes of yellow. And just paint nice and thick. And the reason this is going to go on so easily is because we've primed with that underlayer to start out. So it's going on, it's sticking really nicely, it's not blending all over, it's just holding up. All right, so let's keep going. Let's keep getting that texture with the brush. I like seeing that texture come through. Really makes me feel like I'm really painting. I'm really getting a painter's experience. I get to see the paint really in action, really do its thing. All right, great. So let's just keep moving in that way. Let's get these yellows layered on. And I don't have to necessarily clean my brush when I'm using these, similar colors, because I do want them to blend. That gives my painting a nice sense of unity. I've got this kind of orangey white. Let's bring in more white. See how easily I can bring these colors together when they're organized this way on the palette. Okay, let's get a nice texture. It's nice and sticky is how I would describe it. All right. Keep moving because you're almost there. Once we get these nice textury layers down, we're going to bring in that palette knife. So what I wanted to demonstrate here was that you can get this nice thick texture with your brush painting technique, but then you can achieve different, also good texture, but in different ways, in different shapes, and for different considerations with your palette knife, which we're going to see here shortly. So make sure you get that nice coverage. Just adding a little bit of Galkit as I go, and I'm gonna just work in these last little parts here. A little more white and a little less yellow. Okay, perfect. You can keep moving on these, as much texture, light, shadow, etc. as you want. But let's move on to our palette knife painting. All right, I'm going to take this kind of larger number 44. I'm going to go ahead and just tackle this background. I'm going to get a little bit of this Galkit working in my paint. I'm going to go back to that original paint mix here in this same space. I'm going to utilize some of that leftover paint, and then I'm going to work it on here. And that fatty layer is going to give me this really nice coverage. But because I took the time to make sure that all of my canvas, all the white was covered, then I'm not going to have any white showing through on my final piece. And it looks like we need more green. Let's get that going here. I love this yellow green by Utrecht, that beautiful color that comes through. Let's get a little more Galkit. And you can work quickly here, like we are. We're going to work more quickly than you may have ever with an oil painting. But I like that about this project, because I think that is one of the things that makes it approachable, is the ability to jump right in and get started and learn a lot of oil painting techniques along the way. I think, we're able to cram a lot into this little session here. So let's see. So I'm getting this really nice adhesion. And I can use my palette knife to work into these areas just like I would with a brush. So if you've never used a palette knife before, I highly recommend having at least a couple that you use, especially for oil painting. With acrylic painting, I think you can get away with not always having to use one, but if you're going to be painting with oils, it's huge. All right. And we can blend as much as possible. I love these canvases with the high profile because I like being able to keep them up off of the surface. And then you're going to want to hit these little parts. I won't spend too much time on the details here, but making sure you get these little areas can really help to drive the details home in a piece. So just something to think about as you're working. But let's keep going with our other layers. We don't just want to palette knife the background. Let's get some palette knife action going in this little cone flower of ours. So fortunately we have all of our colors already out here, and we're gonna have a little bit of fun with light and shadow by taking our two oil paint colors, the magenta and the white, and I'm gonna load up my palette knife, putting bunny ears around that because usually when I think I'm gonna, load up, it's gonna be my brush. But I'm gonna load up my palette knife just kind of like I would with a brush and get a nice bit of oil paint on there. And it helps to give some variation to the paint that you're putting down. What an easy way to capture some of that light and shadow, and you don't have any of those any of that unfinished layer underneath, right? You can go right into, okay, and then using it like a brush to make that texture. And you can use as much or as little oil paint as you want at this point in the process. Maybe you want a little bit of texture. You don't necessarily need it to go all over. I think that's part of this too, is, how do you prefer to deal with, your oil painting process? Do you want to, go right into that texture? Do you want to spend time, making it extremely realistic? I think that those are all decisions that we can make as we're discovering more and more about the oil paints. So I'm going to stick with a little bit of texture. Of course, I can always add more. This layer is going to take some time to dry. Let's get a little bit worked in here before we move on to our last and final areas, and then we can always come back to that. So we're getting this really cool texture started. Super exciting. The last thing I want to show you where we can make this texture happen is around this signature, fine line black ink looking area of our Monarch. And I have this smaller palette knife, it's a size 20, and look how teeny tiny this little nib is, but look how fun it's going to be, to get it in those little areas. So I'm just going to load this up, and you can, use your palette knife to make all different kinds of marks and different, I'm gonna sneeze. Excuse me, it's allergy season, and I'm getting the pollen from the existential reference image. We're really living in the moment. So let's go ahead and give this a little final touch. So if you're out there and this is going to be your first soiree into oil painting, I hope that you can take these final takeaways with you on your adventure. And that is, one, using the right painting mediums, okay? Getting something that's going to help you decrease that drying time a little bit, and also that's going to help your paint move along your surface nicely. And the other thing that I would say for you to take away from here is to always remember to paint fat over lean, because it's going to help your paint stick better, and it's going to help you layer better, and you're going to get a much better result when you work fat over lean. So those fatty layers are the oils, and those lean layers are those that have been diluted or broken down with a thinner. Another thing you can take away is that don't limit yourself to a certain number of painting tools. Use a combination of palette knives and brushes that are going to help you cover the area that you want. And I think you'll have a much better experience with those simple rules. So make sure that you go and check out that bundle page where you're going to find these materials, and also that free reference image to help you get started. And paint away. And then let us know how it went. Did you try it? Did you love it? We hope you do. Okay, now, hopefully I have a couple minutes left here, and I can show you these final touches that I'd like to share. The last thing we're going to want to do here, aside from continuing to beef up our texture, as part of that, we want to make sure we deal with our seed pod in the cone flower. And that's just an easy touch. But I want to get it in before we have to cut our time. Load up your palette knife and just make marks. We can do the same thing we kind of did with our magenta painting, and we just want to work in the texture. We can use a combination of these warm colors, and we can easily work in that texture. I'm gonna mix it in with a little bit of this brown. Keep it neutral. The Venetian red, while it is called red, it reads more like a brown. So something to keep in mind as you're looking for colors to help neutralize your palette. But what I love about this cone flower is the way that these oranges and reds are working right into the colors of our Monarch. We're finally starting to bring this painting home and make it unified. And then we're going to want to do the same thing. We're going to want to go back and we're going to want to add details. We're going to want to, we're going to want to refine it. And that's, those are really the final steps here, is to, take your brush, take your palette knife, refine these black outlines, make them look nice and crisp, because that's really going to sell your imagery, right? That's going to make it look done. And I just love playing around with a palette knife. And quite honestly, I could do it all day, and I probably will. And as you work to complete your painting, I think you'll find very quickly and easily that you'll be smoothing over all of these beautiful textures until you find a place where you think, okay, I'm done. The texture is unified, the colors are unified. You know, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the detail because I like the overall finish. This is perfect for me. So what's perfect for you? I hope that you take some time to find out your favorite part of oil painting through this process. And if this is your first time or your 100th time entering into an oil painting journey, I sincerely hope that you get something new out of it every time. So thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you at our next demonstration, and I hope you all have a great evening. We'll see you next time.